September 27, 1942. The order came at 7 in the morning, delivered by Vukic in the same tone he used for ammunition counts and casualty reports. Flat, precise, without decoration. We were moving into the city, not to the flanks, not to hold the approaches or guard the supply lines where the Romanians stood in their thin coats watching the horizon. Into the city itself, into Stalingrad, into the place that men who had already been there looked away from when you asked them about it. I had seen those men. 3 days earlier, a column of German infantry had passed us moving west along the Chir road. They were coming out of the city. We were waiting to go in. They walked with their heads down and their eyes fixed on the ground in front of their boots, the way men walk when they are carrying something invisible and very heavy. One of them looked up as he passed me. He was perhaps 25 years old. His eyes were the eyes of a man who was 60, and he looked at me for a moment, then looked away again, and kept walking. That look. I understood nothing from it at the time. I understand everything from it now. The 369th Croatian Infantry Regiment had been attached to the German 100th Jaeger Division since October of the previous year. We had fought with them across the open steppe, through the villages along the Donets and the Samara, through the grinding advance that had carried the German army to the Volga in what the newspapers back home called a triumph of arms, and what the men doing the fighting called something that cannot be printed. We had earned our place beside the Germans. That was what Petrich told us, the battalion commander. A compact man from Split, who had the habit of standing with his hands clasped behind his back as though he were reviewing a parade ground, rather than a collection of exhausted soldiers in a ruined landscape. He gathered the company commanders the night before the advance and told them what the regiment had been selected for. Vukic repeated it to us the following morning. The Wehrmacht trusted the Croatians. We had proven ourselves at Kharkov and along the Samara. We had held our positions when other Allied units had broken. We had advanced when ordered and stopped when ordered and buried our dead without ceremony and kept moving. And now, as recognition of that service, as acknowledgement of what we had become, the 369th had been chosen for something that no other Allied unit had been given. We were going inside the city, the only non-German formation selected for the street fighting. The only foreigners who would enter Stalingrad not as guards or support troops, but as assault infantry, moving through the rubble and the ruins alongside the Wehrmacht as equals. Vukic said all of this standing in front of us in the gray early morning light, his voice carrying the words the way a man carries something he has been asked to deliver and is not certain he believes in himself. Not quite pride and not quite warning. Something between the two, with something that had no name I knew in Croatian or in German. When he finished, nobody spoke. Then Kovic, who was standing to my left, unslung his rifle, checked the action, and slung it again. That was all. That was Kovic's response to the honor of being chosen, a weapons check. I thought about this later. I thought about it many times. Josip Kovac was 31 years old and had been a soldier for most of them. He had been a soldier before the war, a professional, and I trained at the military school in Zagreb when Croatia was still part of Yugoslavia, and the notion of a separate Croatian army was a political argument rather than a reality. When the war came and the reality arrived, Kovac transferred his skills and his habits from one uniform to another with the same methodical ease with which he did everything else. He was not a large man, medium height, medium build, the kind of face that you could look at for an hour and struggle to describe afterward. And nothing about him announced itself, but the men watched him the way sailors watch a barometer, not because he was dramatic, but because he was accurate. If Kovac moved through a position without stopping, the position was sound. If Kovac paused and looked at something twice, there was a problem. If Kovac sat down and began to clean his rifle, it meant tomorrow was another day and we would be in it. He cleaned his rifle every evening without exception, in the field, in the rain, or in cellars and shell craters and collapsed buildings. Every evening. The ritual was more reliable than anything else in our lives. I had been with Kovac since the Donets crossing 14 months earlier. In that time, I had seen him frightened once. A night artillery barrage near Kupiansk that came without warning and walked directly through our position, killing 4 men in 30 seconds. He had gone flat behind a horse trough, and when I looked at him in the intervals between the impacts, His face was white and his jaw was locked. The barrage lasted 6 minutes. When it stopped, he stood up, checked for wounded, counted the dead, and reported the casualties to Vukic in a voice that was entirely steady. The fear had been real. What he did with it was what mattered. That was Kovac. Danko Tomic had been with us for 3 weeks. He was 19 years old from Zagreb, the son of a machinist, and he had the hands of his father's trade, broad and calloused, and already competent with tools and weapons in the mechanical sense, already trained in the forms of soldiering. But there is a difference between training and experience that no school can close, and Tomic had not yet crossed that distance. I knew this because I remembered being him, 14 months ago on the banks of the Donets, looking at the opposite shore and understanding for the first time that the men over there were genuinely trying to kill me. Not as an abstract military concept, but as a specific and immediate intention aimed at my specific and immediate body. The realization that arrives in the stomach first, before the mind catches up. Tomic had not yet fired his rifle at a living target. This was not unusual. New men often went weeks before their first contact, but I watched him in the days before the advance. The way he sat with his food and ate it without tasting it, the way his eyes moved to every sound. He was an instrument tuned too tightly, vibrating at a frequency just above the edge of control. Juric noticed this before I did. Branko Juric was 43 years old, which made him ancient by the standards of the regiment, and he moved like a man who had made a private agreement with his body to keep it functioning through willpower alone. He was from a village outside Osijek, a farmer's son who had done his military service before the war, and then returned to farming and then been collected again when the war decided it needed him back. He was the kind of man that armies run on and never properly acknowledge. Not a hero in any way that gets written down, not a tactician like Kovac or a leader like Vukic, just a soldier who showed up every day and did what was required and shared his food and made jokes that were bad enough to be funny and new, with the instinct of long experience. When a younger man needed something that was not orders or training or encouragement, but simply the presence of someone who had been here before and was still standing. The evening before we moved into the city, I watched Juric sit down beside Tomic without being asked. Tomic was alone, his back against a brick wall, his rifle across his knees, staring at something the rest of us could not see. Juric lowered himself to the ground with the careful movements of a man whose joints had been arguing with him since the Donets, and sat beside the younger man and reached into his coat and produced a tin of food. He did not speak. He opened the tin and ate from it, and then, without looking at Tomic, held it out toward him. Tomic took a piece of bread from his own ration and dipped it and ate. They sat together in the failing light without exchanging a word. I understood what Juric was doing, and he was telling the boy that someone knew he was there, that someone had decided without being asked that the young man from Zagreb was worth sitting beside on the last evening before the worst thing either of them had ever done. There was no language for this. There did not need to be. We moved out before dawn. The column formed on the road east of the staging area, a stretch of broken ground that had been a collective farm before the war had passed over it and left behind craters and the foundations of buildings and the rusted chassis of agricultural machinery half buried in the earth. Vukic moved along the line checking equipment, his face expressionless in the gray pre-dawn, pausing here and there to look at a man's boots or the way he was carrying his ammunition. Patriot stood at the head of the column with his hands behind his back, and looking east toward the city. The city was visible against the sky, not as buildings or streets, but as a presence, a darkness more solid than the surrounding darkness, a horizon that had teeth. Above it, the sky was lit from below by fires burning in a dozen locations, a constant orange-red illumination that made the clouds glow and gave the smoke columns something that looked, from this distance, like terrible beauty. None of us had been inside it yet. All of us had heard enough to know what we were walking toward. I checked my ammunition for the 4th time. 60 rounds for the rifle, 4 stick grenades, a bayonet I had never used on a living person, a canteen of water and a half tin of meat, and a letter from my mother that I had been carrying for 3 weeks without opening, because I knew that opening it would make me think about the city in Dalmatia where she lived and the street where I had grown up, Why? And thinking about those things clearly and specifically was something I could not afford. Kovic was behind me in the column. I could not see him, but I knew he was there. I could hear him breathing. Vukic gave the order. The column moved. The outskirts came gradually. Not as a line, not as a border between the open steppe and something different, but as an accumulation. First there were fence posts without fences, then walls without buildings, then buildings without roofs. One of their interiors open to the sky like skulls with the tops removed. Then entire blocks where nothing recognizable remained, where the rubble had been compressed and stirred and compressed again until it was no longer possible to say what any of it had been. The road had ceased to be a road. It was a suggestion, a direction. The surface was broken into segments of asphalt and packed earth, separated by craters that overlapped each other so completely that in places there was no surface at all. Only a continuous terrain of destruction in which the craters themselves had become the topography. Artillery had done this. German artillery approaching from the west, Soviet artillery firing from across the Volga to the east. At this point in the battle, it was no longer possible to tell which shell had made which crater. The destruction was collaborative. I could smell the city before I could see it clearly. A sweetness underneath the smoke, underneath the dust, or underneath the chemical smell of burnt propellant and the mineral smell of pulverized concrete. The sweetness of things that had stopped being alive and had begun the long process of returning to the earth. The temperature was dropping by the day as October approached, but it had not dropped far enough or fast enough to stop the smell. The smell was everywhere. The smell was the city's first greeting. Then the first shots came, a single rifleman, one Soviet soldier, position unknown, firing from a row of gutted residential buildings that still had their front walls intact, standing like stage sets, facades with nothing behind them, theater in a burned city. 2 shots, close together. The sound flat and hard in the open air. Someone ahead of me dropped. The column dissolved instantly, the way a flock of birds dissolves when a hawk appears, every man scattering to the nearest cover with the speed of pure instinct. I went into a crater with 2 others and pressed myself against the forward lip and pointed my rifle at the facades and saw nothing. No movement, no muzzle flash. Just those 2 shots, and then silence. Kovic was already moving. He had gone left along the edge of the road, crouching low, signaling a group of 4 men to work around the right flank. They went without hesitation. The rest of us waited in our craters and behind our rubble piles and listened to our own breathing. A burst of submachine gun fire from the right flank. 2 rifle shots. Silence. Kovic waved us forward. When we passed the facades, I saw the Soviet soldier lying face down in the rubble behind the second building. His rifle was still in his hands. He had been alone. 1 man, 1 rifleman had stopped our entire column for 4 minutes. I thought about those 4 minutes for a long time afterward. 1 man, 4 minutes. Should a column of over 200 soldiers pinned to their craters by a single rifle. This was what the city was going to be, not the massed assaults and tactical maneuvers of the open steppe. Something else, something that operated at the level of the individual, the pair, the small group. Something that made every window a potential end and every shadow a pending decision. We continued forward. Nobody had to say it. Everyone understood. In the next hour, we had 2 more contacts. The first was a machine gun position in the basement of a collapsed apartment building, firing through a gap between fallen floor slabs. It pinned us for 20 minutes while Kovic worked a squad around through a series of connecting cellars, moving in the dark through spaces that smelled of old plaster and something older, coming up behind the position and clearing it with grenades. 3 Soviet soldiers dead. The machine gun was still warm when we passed it. The second contact was a fortified crossroads where the roads split toward the factory district, sandbags and overhead cover and overlapping fields of fire. We lost 2 men in the first exchange, both of them within seconds of each other, and the sound of it, 2 men falling in quick succession in the rubble of a street in a city none of us had ever visited before the war brought us here, was a sound that settled into the chest and stayed there. By the time mortar support arrived and the Soviet position pulled back through a communication trench nobody had seen, We had been on this street for 40 minutes, and it had cost us something we could not recover. The factory district was visible ahead. The red October steel complex and the barricades in the tractor factory, three massive industrial structures strung along the western bank of the Volga, their silhouettes jagged and broken against the permanent gray of the sky above Stalingrad. That was where we were going. We dug in for the night in the ruins of a workers' settlement on the edge of the factory approach. What had been housing for the men and women who had worked the steel mills in the years before the war turned their workplace into a fortress. The walls of these buildings provided some cover. The roofs were gone. Above us, the sky flickered orange and red from the fires across the factory district, and every few minutes the ground trembled with the impact of heavy shells from Soviet artillery across the Volga, firing on coordinates into the city that did not need to see its targets because its targets were everywhere. Vukic moved through the positions as the last light faded, checking ammunition, making notes, saying the same thing to each group. We would move again before dawn. The objective was the Red October steel factory. We would enter from the west and push through the complex toward the river. He said it calmly. He always said things calmly. I had long since decided that this was not a natural quality, but a decision he made every morning, the same decision to be the thing his men needed him to be, regardless of what he was actually feeling. I respected this without being able to fully understand it. The weight of what he was carrying on their behalf was something he bore in private. When someone asked about reinforcements, Vukic paused. The pause was very short, but I noticed it. No reinforcements were coming from Croatia, no fresh units, no replacements for the sick and wounded who had been evacuated. The number was fixed. Everything coming out of this city was permanent. Nothing was going in. The regiment had arrived at this battle with what it had, and what it had was diminishing. And the subtraction moved in only one direction. He moved on to the next position. I ate the other half of the tin of meat from the morning, the tin that had tasted of nothing, and now tasted of less than nothing. I drank water from my canteen that tasted of the metal it was made from. I checked my rifle. Then I checked it again. Kovac sat against a wall nearby and cleaned his weapon in the failing light. He did this with the focus of a man performing a sacred rite, each component examined, yet each surface attended to, each mechanism verified. He did not look up while he worked. He did not speak. Tomic was sitting across the ruins from me, his back against a broken wall, his rifle across his knees. He was watching Kovac. Not the way a soldier watches a commander, but the way a man watches something he is trying to understand, trying to absorb through observation what cannot be taught directly. Juric was next to Tomic. He had his boots off and was examining his feet with professional detachment, the way a farmer examines a piece of equipment that is showing early signs of wear. He said something to Tomic that I could not hear, something quiet, and Tomic turned and looked at him and almost, not quite, but almost smiled. We moved out at 3 in the morning. Petric wanted us in position before dawn, humming before the Soviet artillery observers on the eastern bank of the Volga could see us clearly enough to adjust their fire. The moon was up, nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows across the rubble field, bright enough to read by if there had been anything to read, bright enough for Soviet eyes and Soviet pilots to see us moving. We went in single file through communication trenches the German units had dug into the ruins in the weeks before us, channels cut into the wreckage of the city using whatever material came to hand. Some of these trenches were deep enough to walk upright. Others forced us to crouch, knees bent, weight forward, moving with the shuffling gait of men who had spent too many hours in positions the human body was not designed to hold. The walls were reinforced with doors torn from buildings, sheets of corrugated iron, wooden beams from collapsed roofs, anything that would hold back the earth for another day. Now, in places the reinforcement had been hit by shell fire and had given way, narrowing the passage to the width of one man's shoulders. Equipment snagged. Helmets scraped against protruding metal. The man in front of me stopped without warning, and I walked into his pack, and he turned and said something that was swallowed by the low rumble of artillery from across the river. Then we came out of the trench into open ground. 80 meters of churned earth between the last line of workers' housing and the outer perimeter of the factory complex. The ground was beyond recognition. Shell craters overlapping shell craters, pieces of machinery scattered by explosions inside the factory. Steel beams and gear wheels and sections of pipe lying where the blast had thrown them. And between these things, in the craters and against the debris, the dead. German and Soviet both. Some in pieces, some whole, when some frozen in the positions in which they had died. No one had collected them. No one had time. No one could be spared for the dead when there was still so much work to do among the living. Petrich signaled the advance. We went in groups of 4, sprinting from cover to cover, using craters and debris as stepping stones across the open ground. My group went third. I ran with my head down and my rifle clutched against my chest, my boots slipping on loose rubble, away the cold air burning in my throat with every breath. The flare went up when we were 30 meters from the factory wall. White phosphorus, a burning star climbing the dark sky on its parachute, and then at the top of its arc it burst into full illumination, turning the entire area into a flat and shadowless brightness that made every man on that open ground suddenly, completely, perfectly visible. I went flat into the nearest crater. I pressed my face against the earth and felt the cold of it against my cheek and listened to the flare burning above me. Counting seconds the way Kovacs had taught us to count seconds, knowing that phosphorus flares burn for 30 to 40 seconds before they fade, knowing that I had to stay still for those 30 to 40 seconds and could not move and could not look up and could not do anything but hold myself flat and count. 31, 32. The light faded. The darkness came back, out deeper than before, the eyes blinded by the sudden contrast. We made it across, all 4 of us. Not every group was that fortunate. Behind us, across the open ground, I heard it. A burst of machine gun fire, then a shout cut short, then the sound that carries further than any other sound in a battle, the sound that cuts through everything else with a specific and terrible clarity. Someone calling for a medic in Croatian. Laječnik. The word carried across the rubble field thin and desperate and human. A voice that belonged to a man I had eaten with and marched with and shared the particular intimacy of survival with for months, and I did not look back. Not because I did not care, because looking back would not help him, and because Kovacs had told us once, in a voice that left no room for argument, that the worst thing you can do for a wounded man is stop advancing. The worst thing. Advancing was the only thing that could end the situation that had made him wounded in the first place. I did not look back. Then the aircraft came. I heard them before I saw them. The engine note different from the German planes, lower and rougher, coming from the east from across the Volga. Soviet night bombers, the old biplanes they used for this work, slow and quiet, cutting their engines to glide over the positions before releasing their loads. The Germans called them various names. See, most of them unprintable. It did not matter what anyone called them. When they came, the only thing that mattered was where their bombs fell. The first explosions were conventional, high explosive, 200 or 300 meters to our left, hitting the area where the lead elements were already inside the factory perimeter. The ground shuddered. Debris rose in dark columns against the moonlit sky. Then the second wave came lower and dropped something different. The bombs burst in the air, 20 meters above the ground, scattering burning fragments in wide arcs across the advance route. White phosphorus. Wherever the fragments landed, they ignited. White, intensely bright, burning with a chemical fury that had no equivalent in the natural world. It burned through fabric, through leather, through skin. It could not be extinguished with water. It could not be smothered with dirt. It burned until it had consumed whatever it touched, or until it had exhausted itself, and it exhausted itself slowly, with great thoroughness. The first man I saw hit was 15 meters ahead of me. A fragment landed on his pack, and the pack erupted. He stood up. That was the instinct, to stand, to move, to run from the fire the way any person runs from any fire. The instinct that precedes all training and all thought. The movement spread the burning material across his back and shoulders. He screamed. Not words, not a name. A sound that came from somewhere deeper than language, from a place in the human body that exists below thought and below memory. A sound that once heard cannot be unheard. He ran 3 steps. 2 men tackled him to the ground. They tried to strip the burning pack from his body. Their hands caught fire. One of them rolled away, slapping at his own arms. The other kept pulling at the pack straps, his hands burning, pulling until the straps broke and the burning mass fell away. But by then the phosphorus had already reached the skin beneath the pack, and there was nothing that anyone could do about that. Nothing in this world. More bombs fell. Burning points of white light scattered across the rubble field like something that, in another context, in another world entirely, might have been beautiful. Men rose from their positions to help the burning. This was against everything, against training, against tactics, against the most basic arithmetic of survival that says you stay down, stay covered, stay hidden, move forward only when ordered. All of that was true, and all of it dissolved in the face of what they were seeing, because these were men from the same cities, the same villages, men who had grown up in the same streets and trained in the same barracks and shared the same bread for 14 months. And they could not lie still in their craters while their friends burned. And then I saw Kovic. He was running toward the nearest burning man, moving fast and low through the phosphorus light. And this was the moment that stopped me, that I have carried with me in the years since, the moment that told me something essential about who Kovic was beneath all the methodology and the weapons checks and the flat, precise voice. He had made a decision that was not tactical. He had decided in that moment that there was something that mattered more than the calculation. When the man burning on the ground mattered more, not as a unit to be preserved for operational purposes. As a man, as someone whose screaming could not be answered with arithmetic, he reached the burning soldier. He did what he could, which was not enough, which was never going to be enough. It was enough to try. Petrich was shouting orders above the chaos, his voice cutting through the phosphorus glow. Yet trying to keep the advance moving because stopping in the open was death, and inside the factory walls was the only place where the aircraft above could not reach us effectively. He was right. Everyone who could still move understood that he was right. We ran, not in formation, not in groups, not in any tactical order that anyone had ever drawn in any diagram in any training school in Croatia or Germany or anywhere else. Just forward, toward the dark mass of the factory buildings, and toward walls and roofs and anything solid between us and the open sky. My boots hit something soft on the ground and I did not look down. A burst of machine gun fire came from the factory wall, Soviet gunners firing at our silhouettes against the phosphorus glow, and I heard rounds snap past me, that distinctive crack of a bullet breaking the sound barrier close enough that I felt the displaced air against my face. I reached the wall. Brick. Thick. Part of the outer structure of the factory. I pressed myself against it and gasped, and the cold brick was solid against my back. And for one moment, one single moment, it was enough to just be pressed against something that was not moving, something that was still standing. Others arrived, 3 men, then 4, then 7, pressing against the same section of wall, breathing hard, some wounded, some burned, all of them alive. Behind us, across the open ground we had just crossed, the phosphorus continued to burn in scattered points of white light, each one marking a place, each one a name that would be reported to someone, somewhere, eventually. Each one a subtraction from a number that could only shrink. It took 40 minutes for the battalion to consolidate inside the factory perimeter. Petrich counted the men. The count was wrong. It was always going to be wrong after a crossing like that. But hearing the numbers spoken aloud, hearing the gap between what we had been when we entered the open ground and what we now were, made it real in a way that the chaos of the crossing had not. Men I had eaten with that morning were out there in the rubble field, some dead, some still burning, some calling out in a language that the Soviet soldiers nearby did not understand, and the German soldiers nearby did not speak, and the Croatian soldiers who understood it could not reach. When we set up positions inside what had been a storage building on the western edge of the factory complex, the walls still standing to about 2 meters. Above that, nothing. The floor covered in rubble and shattered glass and spent cartridge casings from whoever had fought here before us. We stacked rubble into barricades and established fields of fire covering the approaches and tried to understand the geometry of the place we were now inside. Vukic came around midnight. He moved from position to position, speaking quietly to each group, his voice the same as always. flat and precise, carrying the information that needed to be carried without adding weight to it. The objective for the following day: advance into the main factory buildings, clear and hold. Link up with elements of a German regiment on the left flank. He said it as though it were a simple thing. And the Red October factory had been the largest steel-producing complex in the Volga region before the war. More than 10,000 workers had come through its gates each morning. It had produced steel for railways and bridges and construction projects across the Soviet state, steel for the infrastructure of a country that was building itself toward the future it believed was coming. Now it was producing something else. The furnaces that had made steel were making cover, and the storage buildings that had held raw materials were holding ammunition. The corridors that workers had walked to reach their stations were being walked by soldiers trying to kill each other in the dark. Vukic did not say any of this. He said, "Clear and hold." I did not sleep. Nobody slept. The smell of phosphorus hung in the cold air, a chemical stain that the night could not lift. And in the silence between artillery impacts, in the brief intervals when the immediate neighborhood went quiet, I could hear it, the factory, ahead of us. The sounds of fighting that had not stopped, that did not stop, that rolled through the ruins like weather, like something permanent, like something that had always been happening and would always be happening and would still be happening after every man in this city was dead and gone. Tomic was across the room from me, his back against a wall, his rifle on his knees, his eyes open. I looked at him for a moment in the flickering orange light that came through the gaps in the wall, the light of fires that had been burning for weeks. He was still there. He was still whole. He had run across that open ground under phosphorus bombs and machine gun fire, and he was sitting against a wall with his eyes open, still holding his weapon, still present. I thought about what tomorrow would ask of him, what it would ask of all of us. Then I checked my rifle, counted my rounds, and sat back against the cold brick and waited for the gray light that passed for dawn in Stalingrad. The factory waited with us. It was very patient. It had all the time in the world. On the second morning, the factory was waiting for us exactly where we had left it. It had not changed. We had. The previous night had taken things from us that could not be named precisely, things that existed in the margin between who a man is and what a man can absorb. And what remained was functional and alert and ready to work, but lighter than before, stripped of something it would not recover easily. When the gray filtered down through the gaps in the walls and the sounds of the night fighting settled into the quieter register of early morning, I looked around at the men in our position and saw it in each face. Not despair, something more specific. One, the expression of people who have updated their understanding of what they are involved in and are still deciding what to do with the update. Vukic moved through the positions at 4 in the morning to prepare the advance, and every man he passed was already awake, already holding his weapon, already looking at the darkness ahead with the particular attention of someone who has spent the night listening to things move in it. The factory was enormous. I had understood this in the abstract, and from maps and from the silhouette we had seen against the burning sky. But understanding a thing in the abstract and standing inside it are two entirely different experiences. And when the gray light came and revealed the full scale of the Red October complex around us, the understanding became physical, became something felt in the chest. The main building stretched for hundreds of meters in every direction. Connected corridors and passages and overhead walkways crossed between structures at the height of 3 and 4 stories, creating a lattice of elevated routes above the production floor below. The furnaces stood like monuments, massive cylindrical structures of brick and iron, some still intact, others split open by shell fire, their interiors exposed, glowing faintly with residual heat from fires that had been burning since the first German bombardments weeks ago. Everywhere there was metal, with structural beams twisted by blast into shapes that had no engineering logic. Rails set into the floor for moving raw materials, now bent upward in curves that nothing had been designed to make. Chains hanging from overhead cranes, some still attached to their loads. Machinery housings half collapsed. Sheet metal walls crumpled inward. All of it sharp, all of it capable of opening a man from shoulder to hip if he was thrown against it by a blast or simply stumbled in the dark. And in all of this, in the corridors and the rooms and the spaces between the machinery, In the shadows behind the furnaces and the spaces beneath the walkways, and in every cavity that the destruction had created, the Soviets were waiting. We learned this within the first 20 minutes. The sound was wrong from the beginning. A burst of submachine gun fire came from somewhere deep inside the main production hall. And the sound did not behave the way sound behaved in open spaces or in ordinary buildings. It bounced off the metal surfaces and the concrete walls and the overhead structures until it was everywhere at once, coming from all directions simultaneously. Impossible to locate, impossible to respond to, tactically, because tactics require knowing where the threat is, and in here that knowledge was the first casualty. 3 rounds hit the wall above my head. I dropped behind a fallen steel beam. A concrete chips rained onto my helmet. The man beside me fired 2 shots into the darkness ahead and then pressed himself back behind the beam. I looked at him. He looked at me. Neither of us had any better idea than the other. Then Kovac was there. He had moved through the initial chaos the way water moves through cracks, finding the path of least resistance, ending up where he needed to be with no apparent effort. He crouched behind the beam beside us and looked at the production hall ahead for perhaps 5 seconds, his eyes moving in a systematic pattern, checking the elevated walkways, the spaces between the furnaces, the doorways in the far wall. Then he said, "Pairs, that was all." One word, but the men around him understood immediately what it meant, because Kovac did not use words casually, and when he gave an instruction, it arrived already complete, already thought through, and already the product of whatever rapid calculation his mind performed continuously and apparently without effort. Pairs. 2 men. One advances, one covers. Never more than 5 meters apart. Always one set of eyes watching while the other moves. In a space where the enemy could appear from any direction and where the standard formations of squad tactics were meaningless, 2 men who understood each other could function where a platoon following doctrine would die. He selected the pairs himself, not by rank, by observation. He had been watching us for 14 months, cataloging qualities that no personnel file recorded, and now he drew on that catalog without hesitation. He put Tomic with Juric. I noticed this. I think Tomic noticed it too. The first room we cleared was a workshop, machine tools bolted to the floor, lathes and drill presses, their surfaces coated in dust and debris, and the residue of whatever industrial process they had last performed before the war arrived, and made all industrial processes irrelevant. The ceiling had partially collapsed, leaving a gap through which gray light filtered down in a column that illuminated nothing useful and made everything outside its edges harder to see. We entered from the south. 2 men at the door, 2 covering from the corridor behind. The room appeared empty. We moved forward, checking the spaces between the machines, the shadows behind the larger equipment, the area beneath the workbenches along the walls. Behind the second lathe, a Soviet soldier rose from behind a pile of metal shavings and fired his rifle from the hip. The round hit the wall between us, close enough that I felt the displaced air. Kovac shot him twice in the chest before I had fully processed what was happening. The Soviet fell back against the lathe and slid to the floor. Ornate and the metal shavings shifted around him as he settled, and then there was silence. We checked him. No papers, no identification. Ammunition, 2 grenades, a piece of black bread in his tunic pocket. He looked young. They always looked young, on both sides after they were dead. We left him and moved to the next room. This was the pattern. Room after room, corridor after corridor, the factory breaking itself down into an endless series of small enclosed problems, each one potentially lethal, each one requiring the same sequence of attention and caution and controlled aggression. The work was slow. It was slower than anyone wanted, slower than the timeline that had been described in Petrich's briefing, slower than the rate of advance required to achieve the day's objectives. We lost a man to a booby trap in the early afternoon. He stepped on something hidden beneath a sheet of corrugated iron, and the explosion took both his legs below the knee. The sound of his screaming echoed through the factory corridors, bouncing off the metal and the concrete until it seemed to come from everywhere at once, until the building itself seemed to be producing the sound. The medics reached him and gave him morphine and carried him out on a door torn from its hinges. I did not learn whether he survived. In Stalingrad, you rarely learn these things. Hey, because the men who were taken back did not come forward again, and the men who remained forward did not go back. And the two populations of the living maintained their separation as completely as the living maintained their separation from the dead. The snipers were the worst thing the factory offered. The upper levels, the walkways, the crane platforms, the remnants of floors that were still structurally intact provided elevated positions with clear sight lines down into the production halls below. Soviet snipers occupied these positions with a patience that seemed to operate outside normal human time, waiting with the stillness of objects rather than people, taking one shot and then moving before the shot could be traced back to its source. A man would step from cover to move to the next position, crossing 3 meters of open floor in a second and a half, and a single round would find him with a precision that felt personal, that felt like something directed specifically at him rather than at the general category of enemy soldiers moving through this space. We learned not to cross open areas standing upright. We learned to crawl, to roll, to sprint in broken lines that changed direction unpredictably. We learned these lessons the way everything in Stalingrad was learned. At the cost of men we could not replace, and the tuition was non-refundable. And then we began to understand something that changed the calculation entirely. By mid-morning of the first day, Kovac stopped us in a concrete antechamber between two sections of the main production hall. He looked at each pair in turn for a moment, the way he looked at things when he was accounting for something he had observed. Then he said it plainly, and in the flat voice he used for facts that did not benefit from presentation. The Soviets were adapting. The flanking approach through the connecting passage that Kovac's pair had used to clear a machine gun position at the northeast corner had worked perfectly at 8 in the morning. At 10:30, when Vukic's group tried the same approach on a similar position 200 meters further into the complex, and they found the passage already covered by a firing position that had not been there 2 hours earlier. The Soviets had watched how we moved. They had identified our methods, and they had adjusted. This was not supposed to happen at this speed. In the open steppe battles of the previous year, adaptation took days, sometimes weeks, as information moved up and down command structures and new orders filtered back to the units. Here, inside the factory, the feedback loop was compressed into hours. The Soviet soldiers in this building were watching each engagement, extracting the tactical logic, and implementing countermeasures before the next engagement began. They were learning faster than we were teaching. Kovac said this without visible frustration. He said it the way a navigator reports a change in the weather, as information to be incorporated into the plan rather than a judgment on the plan's validity. Then he began to revise. The pairs would stop using the same routes twice. In every approach to every position would be treated as if the Soviets already knew it and had prepared for it. We would use the factory's own infrastructure, not just the floor-level corridors, but the elevated walkways, the maintenance passages, the spaces above the production floor that the Soviet defenders were primarily oriented away from because their threat was coming from the West and they were watching the West. He traced the logic in the air with one finger. No map, no diagram, so just the spatial reasoning of a man who had spent the morning cataloging the three-dimensional geometry of this building and was now using that catalog. I watched the men around me listening to him. There was no ceremony in it, no drama. He laid out the revised approach, answered two questions, and then we moved. This was what Kovac did. Not inspire, not lead in the way the word is usually meant. He solved the problem that was in front of him, and the solution was always specific, always grounded in what was actually there, rather than what the doctrine said should be there. And the men followed it because it was correct, and because correctness, in this place, was the only currency that still had value. Tomic killed a man for the first time at approximately 11 in the morning. I was not there for it. I heard about it afterward, from Urich, who was there, and who told me in the careful, neutral tone that soldiers use when describing things they have witnessed that they are still sorting through internally. They were moving through a section of corridor in the eastern wing of the main building. Urich leading, Tomic 2 steps behind and to the left, covering the rear. A doorway on the right opened onto a cross corridor, and as Urich passed it, checking the angle as he had been trained to, a Soviet soldier came around the far end of the cross corridor at a run, moving fast. Not expecting contact, the rifle in his hands pointed at the floor. Yurich and the Soviet saw each other at the same moment. The Soviet began to bring his rifle up. Tomich shot him, not Yurich. Tomich from behind and to the left, reading the situation in the fraction of a second available, making the decision before it was consciously made, acting before the thought that preceded the action had finished forming. The Soviet fell. Yurich looked at the body, then looked back at Tomich. Tomich was standing very still. His rifle was still raised. The barrel still pointed at where the Soviet soldier had been standing. His breathing was audible, rapid, not quite controlled. Yurich said, "Keep moving." Tomich lowered the rifle. They kept moving. That evening, when the fighting had paused into the watchful stillness that passed for quiet in the factory, I found Tomich sitting alone in the corner of the storeroom, where our section had established its position for the night. He was sitting with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up and his rifle across them and his eyes fixed on something in the middle distance that was not the wall in front of him. I sat down nearby. I did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say, and I had learned from watching Kovac and Yurich both that the most important thing you can do for a man who is processing something large is to not demand that he process it in words before he is ready. We sat in the shifting orange light from the fires outside for perhaps 10 minutes. Then Yurich came in, but he did not come to sit. He came to work. He lowered himself to the floor in front of Tomich and held out his arm without a word. The bandaging on his forearm had come partially loose during the afternoon's movement, the cloth unraveling at one end from where it had caught on a piece of protruding metal in one of the corridors. So he looked at Tomich and then at the loose bandage and then back at Tomich. Tomich understood. He set his rifle aside and began rewrapping the arm, working carefully around the muscle, his hands moving with the precision of his father's trade. The machinist's hands that knew how to work with things that required care and could be damaged by carelessness. They did not speak. There was nothing to say that the work did not say better. An older man asking a younger one to use his hands for something useful. A younger man accepting the task and doing it with full attention, finding in the specific demands of the work a temporary release from the specific weight of the day. When Tomich finished and tied off the bandage, Yurich examined it once, pressing the cloth to test the tension, checking that the wrap was firm without being too tight. He nodded. He said, "Good hands." He stood up and moved back to his position. Tomich looked at his hands for a long moment. The same hands that had done what they had done that morning in the corridor. The same hands that had just done this. Yurich had just told him what else those hands were for. Not a speech, not counsel. 2 words and a task, and the understanding that a man is not only what the worst moments make him. He picked up his rifle. He was still there. That was what mattered. He was still there. The night brought the infiltrators. Starting around 2200 hours, in the shifting orange darkness of the factory interior, they came. Not a massed assault, not a coordinated attack with a clear axis and a clear objective. Something more frightening than that. Individual Soviet soldiers, or pairs, moving through the wreckage with a silence that seemed impossible for armed men in combat equipment. They used the gaps, the holes in walls that we had checked and cleared and assumed were empty. In the spaces beneath the floor gratings and behind the machinery housings, and above the dropped ceiling sections that we had not known to look at. They came from below, from the basement drainage channels that connected sections of the factory in ways that no map we had showed accurately. They came from above using the walkways and crane platforms in the darkness overhead. One came through a hole in the wall of the room adjacent to mine. A hole that I had personally checked 2 hours earlier and found empty. The shot woke everyone. A man sleeping on the floor with his helmet over his face. One shot, close range. By the time the rest of us had our weapons up and our minds engaged, the infiltrator was already visible in the doorway. And the exchange that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds and ended with the infiltrator dead and the sleeping man dead, and 4 of us standing in the smoke afterward with our hearts running at a speed the body is not designed to sustain. This happened 3 times during the night in our sector alone. Each time the sequence was the same. An alarm in the dark, the sounds of close-range firing in a confined space, the noise bouncing off concrete and metal until directionality was meaningless. A shout, silence, the careful inventory of who was present, and who was not. After the second incident, I understood something that I had not fully understood before about what the Soviets were doing in this building. They were not trying to hold a line. They had no line. They were occupying a space, a three-dimensional space that included floors and ceilings and walls and all the passages and channels that connected them, and they were using every dimension of that space simultaneously, way above and below and laterally and diagonally, in a way that made the concept of a front line meaningless. There was no front line. There was only the factory, and inside the factory, there was no position that was definitively safe, and no approach that was definitively clear, and no moment of definitively held ground. The rules of combat that we had learned in training, fire and movement, supporting fire, flanking maneuvers, fields of fire, all of it collapsed in here. And there were no fields of fire. There were corridors and rooms and passages that turned at right angles and dead-ended without warning. There were stairwells that led up to floors that no longer existed. There were holes in walls and floors that might be deliberate fighting positions or might be damaged from shell fire. Everything was ambiguous. Everything was dangerous. Every cleared room was only cleared until someone came back through the hole in the wall you had not seen, won the drain cover you had walked over, the space between the machinery you had checked with your eyes but not your hands. This was what the Germans called Rattenkrieg. I understood the name now, completely, in the way you only understand a name when you are living inside the thing it describes. We were rats, all of us, Croatian and German and Soviet alike, scurrying through the wreckage of a building that had been designed to make steel and was now being used for a different kind of production entirely. Kovic did not sleep during the night of the infiltrations. He sat at the junction of two corridors with his rifle across his knees and his back against the angle of the wall where the two passages met, giving him a sight line down both directions simultaneously. He turned his head from left to right at regular intervals, a slow, methodical scan, like a lighthouse keeping its rotation regardless of weather. When the first infiltrator came through his sector sometime after midnight, Kovic detected him by sound alone. A faint scrape of a boot on concrete in the left-hand corridor, barely audible above the background noise of distant artillery and the settling of damaged structures around us. Kovic did not challenge. He did not wait to confirm visually. When he shot once into the left corridor, and the sound of a body falling on concrete followed. When we checked the body at first light, the Soviet soldier was carrying 4 grenades, a knife, and a folded piece of paper. The paper was a rough diagram of our positions in the factory, roughly accurate. The main positions were correctly located. The patrol routes were approximately right. The defensive orientations were correctly estimated. Not perfect, but close enough that someone had been watching us carefully and for long enough to make reliable inferences. I showed it to Vukic. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket. On the morning of the second day, Vukic held what passed for a command meeting in a concrete storeroom that still had its ceiling intact, which made it among the most structurally sound locations in our section of the factory. He set out the situation without embellishment, the way he always did, because embellishment used time and time had become the most expensive resource we had. We had taken casualties. The exact number he did not state aloud, but the faces in the room subtracted against the faces that should have been there told their own arithmetic. Soviet resistance was stronger than expected, more sophisticated than expected, more adaptive than expected. Artillery support was available in theory, but in practice unusable because the lines were too close. In many places, the opposing positions were separated by a single wall. A shell aimed at the Soviets would land on us. He asked about ammunition. The numbers he received were adequate, but not generous. He asked about morale. Silence, which was its own answer, and Vukic received it without comment, without attempting to correct it or improve it with words, because false morale is worse than honest exhaustion, and the men in that room were experienced enough to know the difference. He did not offer reassurance, and he did not offer explanation, and he did not offer the kind of leadership speech that appears in the histories written by people who were not there. He received the silence and he sat with it, and he moved on, because the only honest response to the situation was to continue addressing the situation, and that was what he did. Then Kovac spoke. He said the standard approach was not working. Clearing room by room with pairs was too slow and too costly. Not because the pairs approach was wrong, but because the Soviets had already learned to anticipate it. He said they needed to use the factory's own architecture against the Soviet defensive posture. The overhead walkways, the crane rails, the maintenance passages that ran above the production floor. And these gave access to positions above and behind the Soviet defensive line, which was oriented primarily against horizontal attack from the west. He had identified 3 specific routes. He drew them in the dust on the floor with one finger. No wasted strokes. The diagram was minimal and precise and contained exactly as much information as was needed and no more. Vukic looked at the diagram for a moment. Then he looked at Kovac. Then he said, "Try it tomorrow. Take whoever you need." Kovac nodded. That was the end of the meeting. That afternoon in the section of the factory we had cleared the previous day and were holding against continuous probing from the east, Yurich was hit. A mortar round, Soviet, dropped without warning into the open section of roofless corridor, where his pair was repositioning between 2 firing points. The blast was contained by the walls, which amplified the fragmentation. Yurich took shrapnel in the left arm and left side. He went down. His partner got to him and got pressure on the arm wound and shouted for the medic. The medic reached him within 4 minutes. The wounds were serious but not immediately fatal. The arm wound needed proper attention. The side wound needed proper attention. Both wounds would become dangerous if not treated adequately. The medic said Yurich needed to go back to the aid station and be assessed for evacuation. Yurich refused. Petrich was informed. Unter Petrich came to the position himself and told Yurich directly that he was to go back, that the situation was being handled, that his presence was not required to the degree that a wounded man's need for treatment was being overridden. Yurich said he was staying. I was close enough to hear this exchange, not every word but the shape of it, and I watched Petrich's face as Yurich said it, watched the calculation that Petrich performed, wanted the assessment of how much authority he was willing to spend on this particular resistance, whether this was a moment to push or to let go. He let it go. He looked at Yurich for a moment longer, then turned and moved back through the position without another word. Afterward, I sat with Yurich while the medic finished binding his arm. His face was gray with pain, and he was breathing carefully, the shallow breathing of a man managing a wound in his side with every breath he took. I asked him why, but he looked at me for a moment, and there was something in his face that was not the answer I expected, not the soldier's answer about duty or the unit or the mission. He said, "Tomic is not ready to be here without someone who has been here before." He said it quietly without drama, as though it were simply a fact he was reporting, a logistical assessment. The boy needed someone with experience beside him, and Yurich was the person with the experience, and therefore Yurich was staying. When the mathematics of it, to him, were no more complicated than that. I did not say anything in response, because there was nothing to say that would improve on what he had just said, and because the wound in his side was costing him something with every breath he took, and spending words to respond to what he had told me seemed, in that moment, like a waste of something that had value. The night of the second day brought the planning for the assault. Kovac had identified the target, a fortified building within the Red October complex, a 2-story concrete structure that had been some kind of workshop or maintenance facility before the war, now converted by the Soviets into a strong point that controlled access to the central production area. The 54th German Regiment, operating in the adjacent section of the factory, had been trying to take it for most of the day. Multiple assaults, all of them repulsed. The German casualties were mounting. Their commander had requested support from the 100th Jaeger Division, and the request had been passed to the Croatians. Armored support was promised. A Sturmgeschütz, a self-propelled assault gun, would advance along the main factory road and provide direct fire against the building's walls before the infantry went in. This was the plan. Kovac gathered us in a cellar beneath an administrative building on the western edge of the factory. 18 men. He had selected them himself over the previous 2 days. Not the strongest or the best marksmen, but the ones who moved well in confined spaces, who did not freeze in close contact, who understood instinctively when to advance and when to go flat, and who showed no visible indication of wanting to be anywhere other than where they were. He explained the building. 2 stories, concrete, fortified with sandbags at the windows, a machine gun position covering the main approach, firing slits cut through the walls at ground level, and inside field guns, artillery pieces dragged into the building and positioned to fire down the factory corridors. He drew a rough sketch in the dust of the cellar floor. The building, the approaches, the defensive positions as he understood them from observation and from the intelligence the German regiment had provided before their last failed assault. Then he paused. He told us the Sturmgeschütz was coming. Then he looked at us and said that it might not come, that we should be prepared to go without it. He said this in the same tone in which he had said everything else. Nobody spoke. Nobody asked what going without armored support against a fortified position would mean in practical terms. Everyone in that cellar had been in the factory for 2 days and knew exactly what it meant. We checked our weapons. We checked our grenades. I had 6. 4 stick grenades and 2 Soviet F-1 defensive grenades taken from dead soldiers over the previous 2 days. Kovic had told us, in the first days of the Samara campaign more than a year ago, that the Soviet F-1 had a superior fragmentation pattern in enclosed spaces. I had remembered this. I had been collecting them since. We waited. 30 minutes. An hour. Kovic sent a runner to Petrich. The runner came back. The Sturmgeschütz had hit a mine on the factory road. It was disabled. It was not coming. Kovic received this information. He nodded once. He looked at the sketch in the dust of the cellar floor, specifically at the position of the assault gun's projected approach route, and he made a small revision to the diagram with the side of his boot. He adjusted the approach angles to compensate for the absence of direct fire support. Then he looked up at the 18 men in front of him. He asked one question, a simple question delivered in a voice that carried no weight, no pressure, no implication of what the correct answer was. Who wants to stay behind? The cellar was quiet, not the uneasy quiet of men suppressing something, a different kind of quiet, the quiet of men who had already made a decision, silently, individually, at whatever moment each of them had crossed his personal line and arrived at the place past which the question no longer had a useful answer. Nobody moved. Kovac held the silence for exactly as long as it needed to be held. Then he nodded. He turned back to the diagram in the dust and began to describe the new approach. There were maintenance tunnels beneath the factory floor, connecting sections of the complex, designed originally for servicing the industrial plumbing and electrical systems of a working steel mill. They were narrow. They were dark. They connected, if his reading of the factory layout was correct, to a basement directly beneath the target building. He described the approach through the tunnel. Single file. Silence was mandatory. If they were discovered inside the tunnel would become a killing ground with no room to maneuver and no option for retreat. He said this plainly, the way he said everything, as information rather than warning, because the men in front of him were past the point where warning served a purpose. Where the approach was approximately 300 meters through the tunnels to the basement of the target building. If the intelligence on the building's layout was accurate, the basement stairs led directly to the ground floor, to the corridors and rooms where the Soviet defenders were positioned. They would be oriented west and south, toward the German regiment that had been assaulting them all day. They would not be expecting anything from below. That was the plan. So Kovic looked at the sketch one more time, then smoothed it away with his boot. We would go at first light, before the Soviet observers across the Volga had full visibility, before the factory's acoustic environment shifted with the morning activity that would make the sounds of movement in the tunnels harder to mask. He told Tomic and Jurich they were 7th and 8th in the line. Jurich, whose side wound had been bleeding slowly through its bandaging all evening, nodded once. Tomic looked at Jurich. Jurich looked back at him. The expression on his face said everything it needed to say, and said it without words, and said it in a language that existed only between people who have stood in the same fire and come out the other side and know exactly what the other person is carrying. I checked my grenades one more time. Then I sat back against the cellar wall and listened to the factory around us. The sounds of a building that had been designed to shape metal into useful forms and was now being used for something else entirely. And I thought about what the morning would bring, and I did not think about anything past the morning. because past the morning was a distance too great to measure, and there was no instrument available for measuring it anyway. The tunnel was waiting. The building above it was waiting. The 18 men in the cellar were waiting. And somewhere across the Volga, or in the open steppe on the far bank that the war had not yet reached, the world that existed before all of this was waiting too, patient and silent and very far away. We entered the maintenance tunnel at 10 in the morning. The entrance was a steel access panel set into the floor of a collapsed storage room on the northern edge of our held section. A panel that Kovac had found 2 days earlier and said nothing about until the moment he needed it. He pulled it open with both hands, the hinges grinding with rust and heat-warped metal, and the smell that came up from below was the smell of the factory's industrial past. Oil and chemical solvents and standing water, and the cold mineral darkness of a space that had not seen light or air since the war had sealed it off from the world above. He went in first. The tunnel was approximately 1 meter wide and 1.5 meters high, enough to move in a crouch, not enough to stand. The floor was concrete, cracked in places, one with standing water in the lower sections that reached our ankles, and in one stretch, where the floor had subsided from blast damage somewhere above, our knees. The water was black and smelled of things that had been breaking down in it for months. The walls sweated moisture. The air was heavy and tasted of iron, and something older than iron, something that belonged to the deep interior of the earth. We moved in single file, 18 men in a crouch, each one watching the boots of the man ahead, each one aware that the sound of a single misstep, a weapon striking the wall, a boot scraping too loudly on the broken concrete floor, could travel through the ventilation shafts and the pipe systems that connected this tunnel to the building above and reach ears that were listening for exactly that kind of sound. I was seventh in line. Urich was directly ahead of me, moving with the slow deliberateness of a man managing pain in his left side with every step he took, placing each foot with the care of someone who knows that haste will cost him something he cannot afford to spend. His bandaged arm was pressed against his body. His pistol was in his right hand. He did not slow the line. The tunnel branched twice. At each junction, Kovac paused for a moment, oriented himself by whatever internal map he was carrying. The geometry of the factory layout translated into the geometry of the space beneath it, and chose a direction. We followed without question. There was no option for question. There was only forward in the dark, in the crouch, in the silence that we were maintaining with the collective concentration of 18 men who understood completely what breaking it would cost. In the darkness between the man ahead of me and the man behind me, with the black water at my knees and the sweat of the tunnel walls close on either side, I understood for the first time what Kovac had meant when he told us, back in the staging area before the advance, that the tunnels were either the best approach or a killing ground with no exits, and that the difference between those two outcomes would be determined entirely by whether we were discovered before we arrived. There was no middle position, and there was no partial success available in a tunnel 1 meter wide with 18 men in it. There was arrival or there was death, and the gap between them was the width of a single sound made at the wrong moment. I placed each foot with care I had never given to footsteps before. The second branch took us under the main production hall. Through the concrete ceiling of the tunnel, 2 meters above our bent heads, we could hear the war. Gunfire from multiple directions, and the particular flat crack of close-range rifle fire echoing off metal surfaces. The heavier percussion of grenades, voices shouting in Russian and in German. The fighting that had been continuous since we entered the factory 2 days ago was happening directly above us, and we were moving beneath it like something subterranean, something that belonged to a different layer of the same reality. I thought about the men up there, German soldiers from the 54th Regiment, while making their approaches against the building that was our target, drawing the attention of the Soviet defenders, keeping every set of hostile eyes oriented upward and outward and westward. They did not know we were below them. They were bleeding for a result that was going to come from a direction no one was watching. After perhaps 300 meters, the tunnel ended at a concrete wall with a steel access door. Kovac put his hand on it. He tested the handle. Not locked. Warped by heat from the fires above, swollen in its frame from months of temperature fluctuation, but not locked. He looked back down the line at the 17 men crouched in the darkness behind him, each one visible only as a shape, as a shadow in the faint reflected light that came from somewhere behind us. He pushed the door open, centimeter by centimeter. Each millimeter of movement produced a grinding sound that in the absolute silence of the tunnel seemed to fill the entire space, seemed to travel upward through the walls and announce itself to every ear within range. Kovac moved it with the patience of a man who has decided that patience is not optional, that the alternative to patience in this specific moment is a noise that ends everything. He moved it 1 centimeter and waited, 2 centimeters and waited. The grinding of the warped metal against the frame came in small increments, each one controlled, and each one absorbed into the background noise from above before the next one began. It took 4 minutes to open a door. On the other side was a basement, storage, wooden crates stacked against the walls, some broken open, their contents spilled across the floor, coils of steel wire, machinery parts, gears and housings and components that had no context now, stripped from their original machines by the same forces that had stripped everything in this city from its original purpose. The ceiling was low concrete, intact, with a single overhead light fixture that had no bulb and had not had one for a long time. In the far corner, a stairwell. Concrete steps leading up to a wooden door, partially open, a line of gray light visible through the gap. We emerged from the tunnel one by one, spreading across the basement floor in silence, each man taking a position behind whatever cover the room offered. Weapons ready, and eyes on the stairwell and on the ceiling above us and on every other point of potential entry. 18 men materialized out of a hole in the wall, like something the building had been keeping inside itself, waiting to release. Through the ceiling, directly above us, we could hear them. Boots on a hard floor, the metallic sounds of weapons being handled, a voice speaking Russian in a low, steady cadence, the tone of a man giving instructions, movement from multiple points, not random, much purposeful, the sounds of a defensive position actively maintained by soldiers who believed their threat was coming from the west and were oriented entirely in that direction. They did not know we were 12 meters below them. Kovac pointed at the stairwell. He held up 3 fingers. Himself. The corporal whose hands were wrapped in cloth bandaging where the phosphorus had burned his gloves away 2 nights ago. Me. We moved to the base of the stairs. The wooden door at the top was partially open. Through the gap, I could see a corridor lit by gray daylight coming through a shell hole in the outer wall, 15 meters to the right. Dust suspended in the light. The far wall of the corridor with its layers of old paint peeling back from the moisture. The edge of a sandbag position visible at the right end of the corridor. A Soviet helmet above it, motionless. A Soviet soldier walked across the gap in the doorway. He was carrying ammunition boxes. 2 of them, moving from one room to another along the corridor, unhurried, his attention on the boxes and on wherever he was going, not on the door at the top of the stairs behind him. He passed through the gap and disappeared to the left. Kovac watched the gap for 5 more seconds. He held up 3 fingers. 2. 1. We went through the door. The corridor was 10 meters long with rooms opening off both sides. The first room on the right, the machine gun position, a Soviet Maxim on its wheeled mount, sandbags stacked to waist height in front of the window, 2 soldiers crouched behind it, one feeding an ammunition belt into the receiver, one with his eye to the sight, both of them looking west through the window at the German positions and the rubble field between, watching for the assault they had been watching for all morning. They were facing entirely the wrong direction. Kovac shot the first one twice before either of them registered that something had entered the room from behind. The first Soviet fell across the gun. The second turned, and Kovac shot him in the chest, and he fell against the sandbags and did not move. After that, time lost its normal structure. What followed was not experienced sequentially. It was experienced as a series of simultaneous impressions, a compression of event and sensation and decision into a duration that the memory cannot afterward arrange into a clean timeline. The next minutes, however many they were, exist in my recollection not as a narrative, but as a collection of images without reliable order. The rest of the 18 coming up from the basement in a wave. The sound of the assault, grenades and rifle fire in enclosed concrete spaces, the noise enormous and disorienting, bouncing off every surface. One Soviet soldiers throughout the building responding to a threat from a direction they had not fortified, turning from their western-facing positions to find the enemy already inside, already among them, coming from below. A man with a shovel, an actual shovel, swung at the soldier entering his room, the handle connecting with the soldier's helmet and sending him sideways before a second man shot the Soviet from the doorway. What her room where 3 ammunition crates had been knocked over and their contents scattered across the floor. Loose rounds rolling everywhere, a Soviet soldier kneeling amid them, trying to reload a rifle with hands that were shaking too hard for the task. Myself at the door of a room containing a field gun, a small artillery piece positioned to fire through a hole knocked in the eastern wall. 2 Soviet soldiers reaching for their weapons as I entered. I shot one. The man behind me shot the other. A third Soviet, younger than the other 2, standing against the far wall with his hands rising slowly above his head, his eyes on my rifle, his face the face of a man who has made a calculation and arrived at the conclusion that the calculation has run out of options. I pushed him against the wall. The man behind me secured him. In the corridor, Kovic was already moving to the second floor, taking the stairs 2 at a time, a grenade in each hand. 2 explosions above us, close together, the percussion felt in the chest. Then rifle fire, a short controlled burst, then silence. When I reached the second floor, Kovic was standing in a room full of smoke. He was breathing hard. For the first time in 2 days, he was breathing hard. The breath of a man who had been running at the absolute limit of what the body can produce and has momentarily stopped. His rifle was pointed at the floor. 2 Soviet soldiers lay against the far wall. Between them, a small infantry mortar. When its bipod folded, positioned and ready for deployment, but never deployed, because the men who would have deployed it had not survived the 30 seconds it took Kovac to clear the room. He looked at me. I looked at him. The smoke from the grenades drifted in the gray light coming through the shell hole in the wall. Outside that hole, through the dust and the smoke of the factory district, the Volga was visible, the broad gray water moving south, indifferent, eternal. Knowing nothing of what had just happened in this building. It was over. Completely. Entirely. Over. 4 minutes and 50 seconds from the moment Kovic shot the first Soviet soldier in the machine gun room to the moment the last sound of resistance stopped on the second floor. The building that the 54th German Regiment had spent the entire morning assaulting without success. The building with the 3 field guns and the 2 mortars and the Maxim heavy machine gun and the overlapping fields of fire covering every western approach. The anchor of the Soviet defensive line in this section of the factory. 18 men, no dead, 3 wounded, all of them still on their feet. Kovic walked through the building once. He moved from room to room with the systematic attention he brought to every physical space, checking each room, counting weapons, counting bodies, assessing the structure for secondary threats and lingering dangers. He opened doors and checked behind them. He looked into corners and under workbenches and behind the larger pieces of captured equipment. He found 3 artillery pieces, 2 mortars, 1 Maxim heavy machine gun, rifles and pistols and grenades sufficient to fill 2 rooms, ammunition in quantities that told the story of a position that had been resupplied regularly and had expected to hold for a long time. And he stopped at the window on the second floor. He stood there for a moment, looking not at the river but at the German positions to the west. The rubble field, the shattered factory approach, the positions from which the 54th Regiment had launched its morning assaults. From up here, from the window of the building they had been trying to take, you could see exactly how those assaults had been cut apart, exactly the angles of fire, exactly why every approach had failed. But he told one of the men to signal the Germans. A flag, improvised from a piece of cloth and a length of pipe found in the corner of the room, waved from the window in the direction of the German positions. The response came in 20 minutes. They arrived in a group, German soldiers from the 54th Regiment, moving across the rubble field with the careful, economical movements of men who had been crossing open ground under fire all morning and had learned to move in a specific way. Gray-faced, exhausted with a depth that went past physical into something structural, something that had settled into the bones and would take longer than sleep to clear. Their officer entered the building first. A Hauptmann, a captain, his uniform coated in the gray dust that covered everything in Stalingrad, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has been told something and is looking at the evidence of it with his own eyes because he needs to verify it before he can believe it. He walked through the ground floor. He looked at the machine gun position, the sandbags, the two dead Soviet soldiers still in place behind the gun they had never managed to turn around. He looked at the field guns, each one still in its firing position, aimed down corridors that 18 men had come up from behind. He walked to the stairwell and looked up it, and then came back. He found us in the room off the main corridor where the three wounded men were sitting against the wall. Three Croatians with bandaged hands and arms, and one with a cloth pressed against a cut above his eye, sharing a cigarette that Urich had produced from somewhere with the same unhurried generosity with which he produced everything. The Hauptmann looked at the three wounded men. He looked at the captured weapons. He looked at the dead Soviets visible through the doorways of the adjacent rooms. And he looked at the 15 unwounded Croatians standing or sitting in the corridor with the particular stillness of men who have just finished something very intense and have not yet decided what to do with their hands. He said something to Kovac. His German was precise and formal. He asked how many men. He asked how long it had taken. He asked how the approach had been made. Kovac answered briefly. 18 men. Through the maintenance tunnels from the north. When approximately 5 minutes from first contact to last, the Hauptmann was silent for a moment. He looked at Kovac for a long moment, the look of a man recalibrating something, revising an assumption he had been carrying. Then he came to attention, fully, formally, the rigid posture of a German officer rendering a military acknowledgement. And he nodded once, a slow and deliberate nod that carried the full weight of what it meant. He did not speak. There was nothing to say that the nod had not already said, and he was, I think, a man who understood that speaking further would diminish rather than add to what the gesture had conveyed. He turned and began organizing his men to occupy the building. Kovac watched this for a moment. Then he turned to us. Time to go. We left the building. The street, if the space between the ruins could still be called a street, ours was cold and gray and smelled of smoke and the particular mineral sharpness of recently detonated explosive. The sounds of fighting continued from the north and east, from the barricades factory and the tractor factory, from every other section of the endless battle that filled this city like water fills a vessel, occupying every available space. The official record of that morning would say that the 100th Jaeger Division had captured a fortified Soviet position in the Red October complex. For somewhere in the supporting documentation, in a footnote or an appendix or a line in a casualty and achievement report, the 369th Croatian Infantry Regiment might be mentioned. Might be. In the same way that the name of the man who digs the foundation is sometimes recorded in the documents of the building that stands above it. This was how things worked. The Croatians did the fighting. The Germans occupied the position. The reports said what the reports needed to say, and the names that mattered in the reports were German names, and the 369th was an Allied unit, a footnote in the larger story. And everyone understood this, and nobody said it aloud because saying it aloud would require a response, and there was no useful response available. Vukic met us as we returned to our section of the line. He was standing at the entrance to the communication trench that led back to our positions, and he counted us as we came through. 18, he counted again. 18. Something in his face changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been visible to anyone who did not know him well, but I knew him well enough to see it. The small adjustment in the set of his jaw, the barely perceptible release of something he had been holding since we went into the tunnel that morning. He told Kovac that General Sana would hear about this, that there would be recognition, that what had been done this morning would be noted. Kovac said nothing. He sat down against the wall of the communication trench and took his rifle from his shoulder and began to field strip it, laying each component across his knee in the order they came apart, examining each one in the pale afternoon light before setting it aside for cleaning. I sat beside him and let the shaking in my hands subside. It came now, after, the way it always came after. The body presenting its invoice for what it had been required to do when the requirement had passed. One, the adrenaline draining out and leaving behind a fatigue that went deeper than anything physical, a tiredness that lived in the part of a person that is not muscle or bone. Tomic sat down on the other side of Kovac. He sat without speaking, his rifle across his knees, his eyes on the ground in front of him. His hands were steady. I noticed this. His hands were steady in a way that mine were not, and I had been doing this for 14 months and he had been doing it for 3 weeks. Honor and I looked at his steady hands and thought about what that steadiness had cost him to achieve and what Juric had given him to help him reach it. Then Juric came and lowered himself to the ground beside Tomic, with the careful movements of a man whose side wound was speaking to him clearly and continuously. He settled against the wall. He reached over and put his hand on Tomic's shoulder, a single brief contact, firm and deliberate, and then he removed it. That was all. No words, no ceremony. An older man's hand on a younger man's shoulder for 3 seconds in a communication trench in Stalingrad, and then withdrawn. Tomic looked at Juric. Juric looked back at him. The expression on Juric's face said what it needed to say in the language that exists between people who have stood in the same fire, the language that has no words in any tongue and does not need them. Tomic nodded. He looked back at the ground in front of him, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed. Something that had been braced against a weight it was not sure it could hold had settled into the weight instead, had accepted it, had found that acceptance was different from collapse. He was still carrying it. He would always carry it. But now he was carrying it the way a man carries something he has decided is his to carry, not the way a man carries something he is afraid will crush him. He had crossed a line that morning, not from boy to soldier. That crossing had happened in a corridor 3 days ago, with a rifle and a Soviet soldier in a fraction of a second. This was a different line, the line between carrying what war does to you alone and understanding that you do not have to carry it alone, that the men beside you have carried it before you and will carry it beside you, that this is what the word beside actually means when it is used between soldiers. Juric had given him this, without words, without ceremony, and it with nothing but presence and a hand on a shoulder and the willingness to sit in the same space as someone who was struggling and not look away from it. This was what armies ran on. This was what never got written down. I looked at Juric then. His face was grayer than it had been in the morning. The side wound had been costing him steadily since the tunnel, and the afternoon had spent what the morning had started. He would need to go back now. There was nothing left to keep him here that he had not already given. He had stayed for Tomic, and Tomic had what he needed, and the debt was settled in the only currency that mattered. Juric caught me looking at him. He shrugged, a small movement. The farmer's shrug that meant what needed doing had been done, and the next thing would come in its own time. He went back that evening. He did not say goodbye. That was not the kind of man he was. He simply was there, and then he was not. Even the space he left was a specific shape that nothing else would fill. Before nightfall, the Soviets came back for the building. We heard it from our positions 200 meters to the south, the distinctive sound of a Soviet counterattack building from nothing into something, the initial mortar barrage dropping on the German positions around the captured building, the rounds walking in from the east with the accuracy of observers who knew the target well because they had occupied it themselves until that morning. Then the infantry, coming fast, firing from the hip, voices carrying across the factory ruins in the particular register of men who have been told to take something back and believe they can. Coming from the east, from the direction of the river, through passages and channels that ran under the factory floor. The same maintenance tunnels that 18 Croatians had used that morning to take the building from below. The Soviets had found them, or had always known them, and had chosen to use them now, copying the approach that had been used against them with the speed of adaptation that had been their defining characteristic throughout these 3 days. The 54th German Regiment, which had occupied the building for less than 3 hours, was now fighting to hold what it had spent the morning trying to take. The irony was complete and visible to every Croatian soldier within earshot, and it settled over us in silence because there was no energy left for the kind of comment the irony deserved, and because commenting on it would not change anything. And there was nothing left in any of us for gestures that served no practical purpose. The counterattack was repulsed. A German runner came through our sector around 1900 hours looking for the command post. He reported that the building was held. He said the 54th had taken casualties. He said the Soviets had come through the maintenance passages from the north. He said it with the exhausted bewilderment of a man who has spent a day watching the ground shift beneath his assumptions about how this fighting was supposed to work. I listened to him and said nothing. Night settled over the Red October factory. Not darkness, not in the way darkness exists in places that are not at war. The fires burning in a dozen locations across the complex cast their shifting orange and red light through every gap and breach in the walls, filling the interior with a constant mobile illumination that threw shadows in all directions simultaneously and made stillness look like movement and movement look like threat. I found myself at the window on the upper level of our building, looking east through the shattered framework of the factory. The Volga was there, broad and gray and patient, flowing south as it had flowed for 10,000 years before any of this, before the city and the factory and the war and the men who were dying in it. On the eastern bank, open steppe, flat and undisturbed, stretching away from the river into a distance that the night made infinite. Soviet artillery positions over there, with the flash and smoke of guns firing across the water, sending their shells arcing over the river and into the factory district, into the city, into us. Supplies came across at night on barges and boats, feeding the Soviet defenders in the city with ammunition and reinforcements that seemed to come from an inexhaustible depth. We had nothing coming across any river. The arithmetic had been clear since the first night. It only moved in one direction. I stood at that window and let the understanding settle completely, without resistance, the way you eventually stop resisting the things that are simply true. We were here. We were diminishing. We would continue to diminish until the battle ended, or we did, and neither outcome was within our power to determine by will alone. I thought about the men who had come into the city with us 6 days ago, the faces that were no longer in the positions, the ones who had been carried back across the rubble field under phosphorus light, the ones who had been left in the corridor we could not reach, the ones whose names Vukic wrote in his notebook each evening, with the careful handwriting of a man who understood that this notebook was the last record that would exist of these specific people in this specific place. The official reports would compress them into numbers. The numbers would be absorbed into larger numbers. The larger numbers would become statistics in accounts written by people who had not been here, and the statistics would be accurate, and the statistics would mean nothing to anyone who had shared bread with the men behind them. And yet the river kept flowing, and yet the steppe on the far bank remained untouched, and yet the world continued to exist outside this building, outside this city, in dimensions that had nothing to do with the distances between one firing position and the next. Now I thought about Zagreb, about the streets I had walked as a boy, the ordinary streets of an ordinary city, cobblestones and tram lines and the smell of bread from the bakeries in the morning. I thought about my mother's letter, still unopened in my coat pocket, 3 weeks old now, carrying words that had been written in a world I was no longer certain I could fully remember. I thought about the Hauptmann. Kovic came to stand beside me. I had not heard him approach. No, I never heard Kovic approach. He moved through spaces the way the spaces themselves moved, without announcement, without the particular quality of sound that announces the presence of a person. He stood beside me and looked at the river. We stood together in silence for a while, the two of us at the window with the Volga below, and the fires behind us and the sounds of the factory's endless night activity filling the space around us. The artillery from across the river. The small arms fire from somewhere to the north. The distant percussion of something large collapsing in a section of the complex we could not see. Then Kovic spoke. He said it quietly, not to me specifically, not as a statement directed at anyone or requiring any response. More the way a man speaks when he is thinking aloud and has stopped caring whether anyone hears the thought. The river doesn't know our names either. I looked at him. He was still watching the Volga, see the gray water moving south in the darkness, indifferent to everything on its banks, carrying nothing from this city except the water that had always been here and would always be here long after the last shell had been fired and the last report had been filed and the last man who had been here had died in a bed somewhere, with the factory still visible if he closed his eyes and tried to sleep. I did not answer. There was no answer that improved on what he had said. The river did not know our names. The river did not know any names. The river had been here before Croatia existed and would be here after Croatia was forgotten, and would be here in 10,000 years when everything that had happened on its banks in October of 1942 had dissolved into the same geological silence that swallowed everything eventually. This was either the most devastating thing a man could contemplate or the most liberating, and I could not decide which. Ani and I suspected Kovac could not either, and I suspected that was precisely why he had said it. But then I thought about the Hauptmann. I thought about the moment he came to attention in that smoke-filled room, in that building that had cost his regiment a day's worth of assaults and more casualties than anyone had announced. And he rendered a military acknowledgement to a group of foreigners in someone else's war. And he said nothing because there was nothing to say, and he knew it. And the nod was enough because it was true. The river did not know our names, but he had known. In that moment, he had known exactly whose names to attach to what had been done in that building. He had seen it with his own eyes, and he had responded to it honestly, without calculation, on it without the considerations of report writing or credit allocation or any of the other machinery that would eventually process this day into something official and bloodless and correct in every particular and empty of everything that had actually occurred in those 5 minutes in that building. One man, one nod, one moment of accurate witness in a city that was consuming accurate witnesses at the same rate it consumed everything else. It was not justice. It was not sufficient. It would not appear in the history books or the divisional records or the citations that would be written in the weeks ahead. But it had happened. It was real. And in a place where almost nothing was real except the cold and the rubble and the dead and the specific weight of a rifle in your hands. Something real had value even when it was small, even when it was only a nod. I looked at the river for another moment. Then I turned away from the window. Kovac remained where he was, while looking at the water. His rifle was across his back. His hands were at his sides. He was still in the way he was always still when he was watching something. The watchfulness of a man whose attention is the most serious thing about him. In the room behind us, I could hear Tomic breathing. Steady, measured. The breathing of a man who was not sleeping, but was resting, who had found some equilibrium between the pressure of what this place asked of him and what he had available to give. Honor, 3 weeks ago, he had been a machinist's son from Zagreb who had not yet fired at a living target. Tonight, he was something else. Not harder, not colder, not any of the things that war is supposed to make of the men it processes, just more complete, more fully himself, in the particular way that comes from discovering what you can bear and finding it is more than you thought, and from understanding that the men beside you are part of what makes that discovery possible. Jurich had known this. What he had known it the way experienced soldiers know things, not from doctrine or instruction, but from the accumulated observation of years spent watching what men need when the worst is asked of them. He had given Tomic what he had to give, in the specific denominations that Tomic needed, and then he had gone back to get his wounds treated, because that was also what needed doing, and Jurich was a man who did what needed doing, without drama and without requiring acknowledgement. The factory continued around us. It would continue through the night and into tomorrow and into the day after that, and into all the days that remained until there was nothing left to continue with. The sound of it was no longer remarkable. It had become the background against which everything else occurred. The permanent weather of this place, as constant and as unremarkable as the river that did not know our names. I checked my rifle. 41 rounds. I cleared the action and slung it and walked back into the interior of the building, past the positions where the men were watching their assigned sectors, past the corner where Tomic sat with his back to the wall and his rifle across his knees and his eyes open, looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has decided to be present in the place he is rather than anywhere else. I went to find more ammunition. The factory was still there. We were still in it. And tomorrow would be the same? In November 1942, the 369th Croatian Infantry Regiment was withdrawn from Stalingrad and repositioned on the northern flank of the German position. When the Soviet counteroffensive encircled the German 6th Army at Stalingrad in November, the regiment was outside the pocket. Of the more than 1,400 men who entered Stalingrad with the regiment in September 1942, fewer than half came out. The battles inside the Red October factory complex, including the actions described here, appear in German divisional records as operations of the 100th Jaeger Division. The Croatian regiment is mentioned in a supporting capacity. The names of the men who went through the maintenance tunnels on the morning of October 1st do not appear in any account that has been widely published in any language. The Volga still flows south.